Mauga's in competitive, and as usual, I have some thoughts on that. And not only that, but there was a very certain special Metro Overwatch clip, which many of you may have seen, and I have some thoughts on that too, so stay tuned. But first, let's talk about Mauga in competitive. So Mauga was released in competitive yesterday. Obviously, my full thoughts on Mauga, I released a video on that not too long ago. You can check that one out. Not a big fan of his hero design. Obviously, he got some buffs here, some adjustments, mostly just some buffs. And I don't necessarily think it's bad that he's strong going into competitive. That's generally been the track record for Overwatch. They want to encourage people to play the new character. Some of the pessimists out there might be like, well, they want to encourage you to buy the battle pass. But I think just in general, even back in Overwatch 1, the new characters were generally aimed to be released in a strong state so that people would be encouraged to try them out and play them and just play the new game. I mean, people don't know how to play Mauga in full right now. People don't know how to play or didn't know how to play Life or didn't know how to play EDR, at least immediately. So the characters were too weak. It would take too long for them to pick him up. And I think we saw that with Wrecking Ball, for example, who was not a good character in the meta, not super, super OP, and people just didn't play him for long, long periods of time. So anyway, Mauga is strong, definitely is too strong. And the funny thing is that while we're going in the negative, let's talk about the positive. I actually think that a lot of the changes they made yesterday were good changes, just not good changes. But balance hasn't done it in a vacuum, right? Not good changes holistically. In other words, when you look at the base health decreased and the armor increased, I like armor as a flat out buff because it's going to give him more survivability that's not sustain related. The problem is that they didn't actually deal with his sustain. They gave him armor and left his sustain as is. So in a vacuum, this is a good change, but balance is not done in a vacuum. In addition, reverting the incendiary shots change, which was one of the worst changes I think we've seen from balance in a while, made the character feel really, really bad to play. But now he's right back to it. You can actually set squishies on fire within a reasonable rate, which is an awesome change. But again, it's a buff, right? Spread decrease from 1.1 to 1. This is a really nice change. Basically makes it so that you're a lot more accurate with a single firing weapon, which allows you to do damage more consistently at range, heal up and put out pressure more consistently at range, which again, I think is a phenomenal change. Range pressure is probably the most skillful aspect of Mauga, and it was something that you're able to do a lot more consistently now. So love the change. And even this one, so I actually have some interesting thoughts on this one, the overhealth conversion rate. I haven't seen people talk about this one as much, but what this actually does is it means that it doesn't take as much damage to reach your overhealth cap. So if your overhealth conversion rate is 50%, Kitty, no! I have the strangest male cat ever, I swear. He's freaking out. But it basically means that you don't have to do quite as much damage to hit your overhealth cap, which is, I believe, around 100 HP. Correct me if I'm wrong, chat. But anyway, it means that you can actually reach more consistently your overhealth cap while shooting a squishy. And it doesn't only mean that you have to shoot a tank to get that overhealth cap. So the spirit of this is again, definitely a buff, but it's a very quiet, I think, buff, an encouragement to not shoot tanks. It gives you more opportunities to shoot squishies instead. Now, the problem is that, we still don't really see any nerfs to his cardiac overdrive. We don't really see any nerfs. I think we could look at the nerf to the total overhealth that he's allowed to generate. Maybe you could reduce that from 100 to 75 in combination with this buff. But overall, like the character still feels pretty much exactly the same. And that's the problem with these changes is that while they definitely are steps in the right direction, they're just flat buffs on a character whose design is really, really frustrating. You see, Kiriko on release was really, 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 really broken. Arguably just as broken, maybe not even more broken. And she was really, really crappy to play versus Sojourn. Very, 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 very broken. Again, a little bit crappy to play versus. But Mauga might be a new low in terms of how fun the character is to play versus and against. Maybe that's a little bit of recency bias. I think Kiriko was pretty bad at times, but really not a very enjoyable character to play with, against, and even to play as. When we did Mauga Pugs, we did extensive Mauga Pugs playing in mirrors. Terrible. Your experience probably is the same. We played Mauga versus other heroes, other things. We forced people to play, Ryan or Zarya or Winston or Wrecking Ball or Doomfist, Diva. A lot better, actually, a lot more fun. And I actually had fun playing the character in Pugs in those circumstances. But even in non-Mauga Pugs, people talk a lot about Ana, and rightfully so. She is a pain in the butt to deal with as Mauga. But it's not just Mauga, or Ana, excuse me. It's also Zenyatta is difficult. Hanzo is really difficult. Sojourn, especially a damage-boosted Sojourn, is really, really miserable. And even Widowmaker, for example, can be really difficult to deal with in certain maps. And I found, I was playing on Circuit Royale yesterday, and it was a damage-boosted Sojourn. I think it was a Soldier, maybe. Might have been Ediari or Zenyatta with a Sigma. and it felt miserable to play. I couldn't get my self-sustain going. Diving backline, I died too quickly. A lot of it was a skill issue for me, certainly yesterday. I'm just super out of touch when it comes to mechanics, but even then it felt like there wasn't, like looking at it from a coaching perspective, there wasn't a really obvious solution on certain maps and versus certain characters. That a lot of the other dive characters, a lot of the other brawl characters, it doesn't always feel great, but there will always be a strategic solution if you can figure it out. And right now, certainly there's no obvious strategic solution with Mauga, which leads to, again, him being absolutely an unkillable, unstoppable force in a lot of circumstances and absolutely paper thin in others. And I think that's, again, a bad design flaw. And I wonder if even with some of these systemic changes that maybe will help things, I don't know if it's going to be good enough to actually fix the problem. So remains to be seen. So anyway, I'm going to remain cautiously optimistic because that's the way I like to do things. These changes definitely hit on the right notes. It's going to be a long 2 weeks unless they hot fix it. I know the balance team is going to be going on a little bit of a Christmas break here. So let's pray that competitive isn't too bad the next 2 weeks, but I'm cautiously optimistic for the long term, but for the short term, I do think these next 2 weeks are going to be pretty rough. Okay, so let's talk about this Metro clip here. I'm going to let this play really, really fast. I'm going to let you kind of draw your own conclusions. I'm going to give mine.
Yeah.
They're looking at me now.
I dare you.
I'm gonna pull them
It is
together.
so ridiculous that they can do that, right? Be an absolute shitter. See, if the Sojourn commits, right, he dies because it's fair. If the Kiri commits, she can just get out after missing everything. That was the perfect example. These last 20 seconds showed everything that's wrong in a 1.
I'm playing up.
Okay, so let's talk about a couple of things aside. I want to address the elephants in the room really, really quickly before we get to the systemic issues that Metro is talking about. The obvious things that factors into this to an extent is Metro played this one really poorly. He took chip damage from the Roadhog. He's sitting on the floor. He's all the way in the enemy backline, but he's not even positioned very well for it. He doesn't hit a particularly good helix off of the wall climb. The Sojourn slides in without rail. She also misses her rail, I think, there. She misses her disruptor shot, and she slides in. She uses her defensive cooldown to get out, and then the Kiriko finishes him off after the Sojourn and Roadhog had already done damage. So regardless of the 1v1, I think the 1v1 was played really poorly by both the Soldier, by the Sojourn, and honestly, even to an extent, the Kiriko. But the difference here is that the Kiriko is allowed to get out, reset, and try again. And I think that's kind of exactly what Metro is complaining about right here, is that Kiriko is allowed to get out scot-free and isn't punished for it. And this is where I think that my take is going to be nuanced. You see, what Metro doesn't realize is that this right here is a really important moment in this fight, especially if he was better positioned for it. Forcing Suzu is not nothing. Forcing Suzu is a 15-second cooldown, an extremely important cooldown that counters a lot of ultimates, allows the Kiriko to take better angles elsewhere, and it was forced really almost instantly by just a little bit of soldier tracking with no real cooldown commitment from Metro outside of the heal station, which, to be honest, was more to do with the chip damage that he'd taken from the Roadhog in the first place. So the problem with this is that Metro is malding about forcing Suzu and the Kiriko getting out and acting like that isn't value. That is value. That means that the Kiriko has to sit inside of her own backline and will be a worse heal bot, be a worse healing support as a result, because not only is she not angled aggressively on his backline, he's much better equipped to deal with the Kiriko 1v1 than his supports are, but also that this Kiriko doesn't have Suzu for any sort of trash, crap, nade, ultimate, anything thrown towards his backlines way. So the Kiriko is taking a risk here and screws up. So even though the Kiriko survives, survival doesn't mean that you're winning the game. And if that sounds familiar, if you've been paying attention to some of my Orisa discussion, that probably sounds very familiar because that's the same problem with Orisa. Orisa can live through everything, but it doesn't mean that she's necessarily winning or carrying or contributing to her team's fight. And so the problem here is that Kiriko will TP back to her team. Maybe his team uses an ultimate and then they lose the fight. They're like, oh, we lost. I don't know what happened. The Kiriko, this soldier angle forcing the Suzu is why they won the fight. He just doesn't know it. And that's something that's been frustrating a lot of Overwatch 2 players, especially tank players, where sometimes it feels a little bit like cooldown forcing simulator, but you're not always the person getting the kill. So it's that indirect versus direct value. If you've been paying attention to any of my stuff, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And it can feel really, really, really frustrating. The question is that a design flaw? Is that something that needs to change? And I think there is a good argument that to an extent, it ought to change. It ought to feel a little bit more rewarding to force those CDs Or we should have characters that involve a little bit more risk when they go for plays like these. Because the problem is that even if Metro plays this one perfectly, the Kiriko should never die. Should never die. And I think when you have a character that should be unkillable, and that's their way of value, then that's something that's a little bit tricky. Now, I'm actually a little bit of a Kiriko apologist. I do like the character design in many ways. I like the dynamics of her positioning. I like a lot of her skill expression. I think she is, in some ways, frustrating, but is actually one of the more skillful characters in terms of skill ceiling. Now, some of you in chat will be like, blah, 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 blah. Kiriko actually has one of the lowest win rates across all supports and is historically very, very bad in mid to low ranks and only gets good in higher levels where teams have better mechanics and better Suzu management. Kunai are too big, her hitbox is stupid, I agree, but it doesn't mean that she's necessarily winning more games than the average support. Other supports are way easier to get value out of a Kiriko. But again, we're not talking about what actually feels good, or what is actually good. We're feeling at what actually feels good. And Metro, while he's not being logical about this, is expressing his emotions in an accurate standpoint that is not Metro alone. A lot of people have this exact same frustration. And I think that's the key thing to note here. Should a support have the ability to basically disengage any fight that they're losing? And this is not the first time that we've had this discussion as a whole with Overwatch. Obviously, Orisa's raw survivability is something that frustrates a lot of people in a similar fashion. I think Tracer has also historically been one of those characters where she can mostly disengage any 1v1 that she's losing. But even with Tracer, there's more of a risk of, hey, you might mess up with Kiriko. And I also think that Tracer's movement and avoiding of damage is more skillful than Kiriko's strafe spam. And also there's another important DPS that recently got changed away from this playstyle, and it's Sombra. Sombra's initial playstyle in Overwatch 2 with her old translocator was any 1v1 that you think that you're losing, you can completely disengage, and it's almost impossible to counterplay. And that is very similar to how Kiriko plays right now. And big shocker, the devs decided to move away from that playstyle because they felt that it was too frustrating to play into a Sombra that, hey, it's value because you forced her out. It's value because she's doing nothing right now. She's not as valuable. That's exactly what's the case with Kiriko. But it's not fun. And so now Sombra has to have a little bit of skill. There's a little bit of risk involved with using that translocator. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see Kiriko moving in that direction in the future so that we have fewer moments like this where it feels like you're being cheated out. Again, I want to point out that the difference between Kiriko and so many of these other supports is that a Kiriko will lose a fight and she may not know why she lost the fight. It's because she wasted her Suzu in a 1v1 or she was on a bad angle or she was heal botting her team. So the problem is how much of Overwatch 2 should be focused on that indirect value and versus how much more should it reward you for feeling better. People talk about this like it's a support problem. And I think to an extent, supports have more ways of dealing with this because with the support passive and having one fewer tank to keep up, there's more flexibility to use your sustain, to use your cooldowns selfishly and to not use them selflessly. And so, but I don't necessarily think that's necessarily a problem in of itself if we can look at a case-by-case basis. Metro only plays DPS mostly. He's just a DPS player, so he's going to look at things from a DPS standpoint. Support player is going to look at things from a support player standpoint. Tank player is going to look from a tank player standpoint. Pretending that there isn't some sort of bias involved, even in myself, is complete foolishness and nonsense. Metro is very biased. And that's going to influence his take here. Support players in the replies are very biased. That's going to influence their takes here. Forcing cooldowns alone isn't something that's satisfying for the player base. But at the same time, saying that, one soldier should just kill Kiriko and Kiriko shouldn't have the opportunity to win is also silly. I think that if played properly, Soldier generally has a slight advantage in the 1v1 if the Kiriko doesn't have teleporter. But that's a big if. Kiriko can continually take the 1v1 until she has an advantage and then stick with it. And that's something that can definitely be a frustrating experience. So yes, I think that we have to have a discussion about this. No, this isn't really a good representation of what everything that is wrong with support. This is just an emotional outburst that does raise some good questions that we can consider talking about. And I think if you think otherwise, I think you're kidding yourself. This is a 1v1 that Metro should not only have won, should have lived. He actually got his heal station again. If he'd been better positioned, then he would have been in a better position to kill. Anyway, long story short, I think that we do have a problem of whether indirect value is enough to keep players playing the game. And I think that's something that needs to be considered moving forward in Overwatch 2. Anyway, hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. And that's going to be it for me.